Hey guys, sorry for the long wait, but I am back with a new, quick video on how to make a very, very popular sound in dubstep and brostep. Now, funnily enough, despite the fact that this sound is extremely common to see in any form of electronic music, as far as I know, there isn't really a name for this sound, which is why in the past I struggled to make it, because I didn't know what it was called, so I didn't know how to look up advice on how you make a sound like this. But I've always just called it the brostep bass scream. The kind of sound I'm talking about is this. And I remember in the past, I always assumed this must be done with some very precise frequency modulation. Since this is mostly used in dubstep and its subgenres, and of course FM basses are super common there, so it makes sense for this to be an FM bass. And like other FM basses, it does seem to have that very aggressive mix of high and low frequencies. But most FM basses sound pretty sharp and metallic, whereas this one sounds clean and quite smooth, for lack of a better word, which is surprising. As a result, when I first tried to replicate this sound a few years ago, I just sat down for hours trying to replicate it. And the closest I got was some FM basses that were very screamy and sort of the same texture, but just a bit too metallic and sharp, and not quite as clean as the real sound. Eventually, I gave up on trying to figure out how to make this sound, and funnily enough, that's when I found out how to make this sound. I had randomly stumbled upon a Seamless tutorial on how to make it, and this was a few years ago. Since then, this bass has now become a staple in a lot of my tracks because I really love this kind of bass design. That being said, while I am going to cover the same basic points, I'm not just going to regurgitate what Seamless said in that tutorial. The best part about this sound though is not only that it is a good sound, but as it turns out, there's a reason it was so common across so many artists. That's because this sound is actually insanely easy to make and very easy to modify and customize. Which might surprise you. Again, I spent hours trying to replicate this, and I always thought it was something to do with FM. But no, do you want to know what this sound is without the effects under the hood? It is nothing more than a very, very low-pitched sine wave being combined with a very, very high-pitched sine wave. The only thing that makes it sound the way it does is distorting those two sounds together super aggressively using a wave shaper. Seriously, that's all there is to it. You can try it now. If you open up Citrus, make operator 1 just a normal sine wave, and operator 2 a sine wave of a higher harmonic, and then play a very low note on that Citrus. If you then feed it through a very aggressive wave shaper, you will get this sound. And what's great is there's no solid rule on which sine harmonic the higher pitch has to be. In fact, there's no rule saying it can't be multiple sine harmonics. You can mix and match things to get different tones, although generally, in my experience, the best frequencies are usually in between the 16th and 32nd harmonic range. Another thing that's really cool about this bass is because it is made using very aggressive wave shaping, there are a lot of other things you can do to accentuate the sound in interesting ways. You see, for any of you who weren't already aware of this, if you apply an effect before you distort a sound, then the distortion will also exaggerate that effect. And so by applying even more effects to the sine waves before you feed them into the wave shaper, you can get some very interesting results. So here's a couple examples of how I've used this sound myself recently. First of all, many of you will have heard how at the end of Solstice, this bass is used at the very ending of the final drop. Granted, this one in particular has quite a lot of effects on it to spice it up, which I'll get into later, but it's the same basic sound and concept. Another way I've used it recently, which you won't have heard yet, is that I have been making some music for a game that some of my friends have been working on, And this is some music that I've made for a cave level. So this is actually an application of the sound that is actually as soundtrack, background, tone setting music rather than dubsteppy music. As you can hear, it really helps establish this sort of tense atmosphere in the caves. Now, this sound is great, but it does have one drawback you should keep in mind when using it. That being that this sound does not have a lot of dynamic range. In other words, the volume of this sound doesn't change much. Because you're distorting the sound so heavily with the wave shaper, it means that there's basically only one volume for this thing. Very, very loud. And you can't really make the volume change much, because the very thing that makes the sound the way it does is the fact that everything is so crunched up to maximum volume. As a result, at least by default, when you make a sound like this, you won't be able to get a lot of dynamic range in it. Now, in fairness, that's also kind of part of what makes this sound so smooth and satisfying to listen to, is the fact that the volume doesn't change much. So, as long as you use this sound appropriately, that won't necessarily be an issue in terms of, oh, the track is too boring because the volumes don't change enough. What might be a problem, though, is that you'll struggle to mix things effectively if you've got this sound that takes up so much of the audio space because it's just so loud at all times, and it never quietens down because the only volume it can be is super loud. It's like a wall of sound with no cracks in it to sneak anything else in. For example, that's why at the end of Solstice, when I use this sound, it's basically completely alone in this section, which is unusual for me. I tend to fill sections with a lot of different kinds of basses, a lot of overlapping sounds. But here, I just have this one bass, because it's simply such a wall of sound that takes up so much of the frequency spectrum that is constantly loud that I don't think much else could be fit in here without the sound either clashing with the original sound or being drowned out by it. All that being said, there are some workarounds for this. For one, there are 3 ways that you can try and mix loads of sounds together at once without them completely drowning each other out. Now, technically, this advice applies to any sound in the world, so you can use this elsewhere. I'm just giving this advice here since it's especially important for this sound. The most obvious way is simply to let one sound fill in the gaps where another sound is quiet. But of course that isn't an option here, because this sound is always loud. The second option is to have other sounds fill in the frequency ranges that certain sounds leave holes in. But once again, since this sound is made by crunching together some extremely low-pitched and high-pitched frequencies, we kind of have the whole frequency spectrum covered, and there's not really room to fit much in here. So this is where the third option actually becomes very important, and this is one that I think people overlook a lot, and I don't blame them because it's such a small thing that's easy to forget about. When you listen to music with headphones, you have 2 ears, and that doesn't just allow you to put some sounds in the left ear and some sounds in the right ear. There's also a certain trick you can use to make it so that sounds sound like they're either coming from directly in front of you, or they sound like they're surrounding you by using the left and right ears in combination. Now, you don't have to fully understand how this works right now. I might make a video on that in future. All you have to know is that with Fruity Stereo Enhancer, by turning this knob further to the minus section, you can make the sound very solid and in the center and unmoving. Whereas by turning it up further to the plus, you can make it so the sound feels like it's surrounding you and all around you, but that also does result in it sounding less solid, for lack of a better word. In other words, you can mix other sounds in with this sound without them drowning each other out if you put this sound in the center. It's a very hard-hitting sound, so it's probably best in the center and not spread out. Although there might be scenarios where you find it better being spread out. It depends on the music, of course. Either way, whichever one it is, if the other sound being played at the same time is in the opposite place, then that means both sounds will be able to be heard more clearly, even if both sounds are very consistently loud and both are fighting for the same frequency ranges. Now that might make you ask why I didn't use this same technique in Solstice. Well, the reason why is because in Solstice I added a big powerful reverb to the sound as well to spice it up. And while the main sound does indeed have a stereo enhancer on it to crunch it hard into the center of the stereo image, the reverb of the sound fills out the rest of the stereo image by filling out the parts that surround you. And so as a result, there isn't much room for more sounds because the reverb covers the only space the main sound doesn't. However, I really like this reverb. I thought it sounded really powerful and it fit with the wintry vibe of this song, so I kept it as it was. Anyway, all that aside, there is one other way that you can make this sound not be so flat, so to speak. While the volume will always be consistently loud on this sound when you first punch it through the wave shaper, there's nothing stopping you from putting more effects on it after the wave shaping. As you feed this sound through a multi-band compressor and make it so that certain frequency ranges fluctuate in volume more, you can give some dynamic range back to the sound. Although this is quite a bit of work, admittedly. While the total volume of the sound might always be loud, whether it's the low end or the high end that's particularly loud will change over time as the sound is played. And so you can kind of use that to your advantage with multi-band compressors to make different compression curves for the 3 different frequency ranges and make it so that they all kind of fluctuate in volume differently. Another thing you can do if you just want the dynamic range to be subtle, you don't want the volume to change too much, but you just don't want it to quite be so flat, is you can do what I did with the Solstice bass, where I made this strange wave shaper curve. Usually when I make this bass, I just make it an upwards curve and that's it. But here I made 2 curves because I wanted it to get near to full volume very quickly, but then have this extra little section where it just doesn't quite hit full volume until it hits the next bump. That way, when the note is first played, it actually hits maximum volume and quickly dips to near maximum, but not quite all the way there. I also added a whole lot of little effects to this sound to spice it up in Solstice that just really change the tone. If I remove all these effects, you can see that while it's definitely still recognizable as the same kind of sound, it is quite different, noticeably so. The effects in particular are a half-mix pitch shifter, a half-mix bit crush, and also a little bit of an extremely short echo, which if your echo is short enough, it creates a sort of metallic tone to the sound, which I wanted to exaggerate through distortion. As a side note, and this might just be my obsession with bit crush, but I find bit crush to be very effective on this sound. If you ever have a sound that has some extremely high and slightly grating frequencies to the ears, see how it sounds with bit crush, because the reduced sample rate of a bit crush effect makes it so that certain higher frequencies can't be replicated correctly. However, that usually causes the sound to not disappear at higher frequencies, but simply be moved down to lower frequencies. This is to do with something called Nyquist, which I'll probably make a video on in future when I actually want to get in depth with that. With all that said, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'm sorry for the silence on this channel. I'll try to upload here more often, but no promises, alright? Sorry about that. But I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.